third time I'm saying good morning, everybody. Okay. So I'd like to invite the panelists on stage. Like all of you saw in the multimedia presentation that we just had, that one of the aims that we at the Gnostic Center put forth for ourselves was a bridge between matter and spirit. And it is no wonder that we've picked up this topic on money on our 25th year. The topic that we will be discussing today would be the power of money in a quest for a conscious life. And I'd like to read some words of the mother in this context. The mother said, "What makes money a power? It is a force that is behind it. It is a force that is able to attract and use anything, whatever, all material things." She goes on to say, this force, when it is made to move, to circulate, its strength increases. It is not something one can accumulate and keep without using. It is a force which must always circulate. With this, I would now like to introduce my panelists. Dr. Pramad Sinha. For me, I think when I invited him, it was because I felt he was really an institution builder, and all of us can learn a lot from him. He is the founder and trustee of the acclaimed liberal arts university, Ashoka University. The founding dean of the Indian School of Business, the founder of the Harappa Foundation, the Naropa Foundation, the Young India Fellowship. For his contribution to education, Dr. Sinha was awarded the Personality of the Year by FICCI in 2015, and he has been named as one of the India's top 50 management thinkers by Thinker 50 in 2013. My next panelist is Ms. Monica Hallan. She is the author of the best-selling book, Let's Talk Money. She is also a trusted personal finance writer, speaker, and author who helps families get their money decisions right. And above all, I think, she has studied a lot on what Mother and Sri Aurobindo have said about money. So she would be an ideal part of the panel. Then there is Mr. Manuel Thomas. He is a senior practicing chartered accountant in Chennai. He's done a lot of research and in-depth research on the economy of Auroville and has brought out a book, Economics for People and Earth, the Auroville Case. Initially, I think it was titled as 1968 to 2008, but now he's revising it for the next 10 years, so I think soon it'll be out again. And my last and the fourth panelist is Amita. For me personally, she is a shining example of this bridge between matter and spirit. She heads the Gnostic Center, as well as one of India's top breeding farms of thoroughbred racehorses. She was the recipient of the Outlook Business Women of Worth Award in 2017 and has won the Champion Stud Farm Award 8 times. Amita went through an intensive study of integral yoga for 12 years under the guidance of Dr. Nirod Baran, who was the literary secretary of Sri Aurobindo. Now, before we move on, I'd like to just introduce the format of the panel that we've planned. I would be giving each panelist 5 to 7 minutes to give their opening remarks. Then I'll throw some questions to all of them, and any one or all of them can answer those questions. Thereafter, the audience is free to also bounce off sub-questions to the panelists, so it can be more interactive. With this, I'd like to invite Ms. Monica Helen to give her opening remarks.
Thank you so much. I have to admit it's a little intimidating to see all the luminaries who have worked so much, reading, internalizing. But I will stay with what I know, and I have worked for many years understanding this money. And I've understood it as a journalist. I've understood it as a person who thinks about policy, regulation. And I also understand it from the point of view of households. I understand it personally because whatever work that I have done, I have first tried to make it work for myself. So if I am, as a journalist, writing something, I have tried to first experience it myself, because that I felt gave it a deeper connect with what I was saying. And Ritika said that the book is a bestseller. You know, it's a book on money. What is it that is connecting with people? Because it's doing well beyond what I had thought. I think it is that deeper connect, and which has come from whatever limited understanding and experiences I have had with Mother and Sri Aurobindo's work. So just opening on this. So we are talking about the power of money in the quest for a conscious life. I want to open by saying that lack of money doesn't prevent a conscious life. And everybody, I think we would all agree that money is not an essential ingredient for living a conscious life. But having the money power gives an opportunity of a greater focus, and it helps enable a growing concentric circle of enabling yourself and others onto this journey that I think we are all in. But I'm going to step back and say that, the reason that we are even talking about something like money is that we find this bridge between what we perceive to be a greater inner life and outer life, using the bridge of money very difficult. And as Indians, we've had a very difficult relationship with money. It's not been an easy relationship for two reasons. One is that almost every religious and spiritual discourse is a little afraid of what possessing money can do to the possessor. It ends up possessing rather than being possessed. So most of the disciplines are, they sort of say that you have to abandon any attachment to money, you have to abandon the desire for possession. So we are sort of brought up in this ecosystem which says that for a greater, deeper life, you have to discard money. So that's sort of the backdrop. That's at a deeper, it's there in our overall environment, because I think every family has stories, we are all deeply connected. The other reason that we have a difficult relationship is more historical. We've been a poor country for generations, for centuries we've been a poor country. And because of invasions, colonization. When there is no hope for a people to ever get rich, ever have wealth, in a way that you can look at yourself in the mirror, then it is easier to put poverty on a high moral ground. Right? So we will say things like Hath Kamel, the ill-gotten gains. The movies also show a progression of that evil moneylender, the smuggler, and all of us, some of us are of the generation who remember that movie Diwar. So the poor brother is the poor, sorry, not my phone, okay. The rich brother he's got Gadi, Bangla, Shohrat. He's a smuggler. The poor brother is a police officer. Mere paas maa hai. So if you look behind the symbolism, you're putting this whole poverty and not going after wealth on a high moral ground. And we see it over time in Indian cinema that you have to, anybody who's rich has got it the wrong way. Until date, when we talk about the top businessmen of India, we are talking about how big their houses are, how lavish their weddings are, how, all the ills of the world, like debauchery, corruption, all sort of get clubbed with the possession of money. And I'm saying we have to look at ourselves and say that this was coming out of our past, of a time when we couldn't ever hope to get rich. But it's a new country, it's a different world. And the aspiration of wealth by a set of people who have a deeper conscious life is something that each of us must do. Being rich is very good. It buys you an oxygen tank, it buys you a hospital bed, it can get you an education abroad, it can get you what you want. So being rich, having the money is absolutely important. How you earn it and what you do with it are the two things we should deeply think about. So as a people, I think we should desire money. We should take it away from the asuric forces and get it. And how do you get it? There are ways to get it honestly now. Tax-paid rich in India are entirely possible. And then what do we do with it? Those are the two questions I would like to think about. So I will stop here.
Thank you, Monica. I think you've given us a lot of food for thought. And now I'd like to ask Dr. Pramad Sinha to give his opening lines.
Thank you, Ritika. Thank you very much for inviting me. Though I don't know what I'm doing here, I don't think I have anything in particular to say any more than what all of you probably already know. But I thought I'd just share 3 stories that have always guided me in my quest or deployment of money that I may have. So my mother used to always chase me for not working hard at my studies, and I had 3 older sisters who were all high achievers, and she used to think that got us some music. So she was always worried that I would not do well. So she would use the gender card and say that, see, your sisters are doing so well. How can you, as a boy, not outdo your sisters? My father would always not scold me or get after me, but use only one angle. And he would say that, listen, when you grow up, you have to earn 10,000 rupees a month to have a comfortable life. And I thought that was easier for me to understand, so I used to kind of just follow that goal. So when people ask me, so what did you plan to do when you were growing up? The answer is really that I just wanted to get a job that I could make 10,000 rupees a month. And it's so deeply ingrained that that number hasn't changed for me over the years. And sometimes when people start discussing lakhs and over the years crores and so on, it's just easier to remind yourself that that was the goal, and you don't have to go much further beyond the goal. I don't mean to sound preachy, but I'm sure all of us have these stories. And at least for me personally, whenever there's a dilemma, going back to that story always helps. That's all I had to do, and that's all I needed to do. Recently, my mother passed away, so I'm looking after our home in Patna, and I realized that all my clothes in the days I was growing up was actually shared in a cupboard with her on just one shelf. And so I think all of us have these stories, and all of us have generally had modest upbringings. Amita was telling me about your 50 paisa a week pocket money, sorry. So I think just for me, one part of this connection between, if you call it matter and spirituality, has come from just going back to our roots and constantly never forgetting that and reminding ourselves. One sad story over there was that I'm very close to Rajat Gupta, who was indicted in the insider trading in the US and spent time in jail. And he's very close, I'm very close to him, so I would always visit him in jail whenever I was in the US. And he would actually tell me that, you know what, I can't tell you how little you need, especially when you're in jail. So I think I have found one way to keep yourself grounded and not be chasing. One of my good friends from McKinsey is here. He's a venture capitalist and private equity guy. And I have a startup, like she mentioned, Ritika mentioned. So these days, I'm building the startup, and the numbers that people throw at you are just nuts. You don't know how this money is even justified. I've been working at it for 2 years out of my 40 years in my life, and just these 2 years of work can create that much wealth. It makes absolutely no sense. So you have to find always something to keep you grounded. So I just wanted to share the story that for me, 10,000 rupees a month of my father's goal is one way to. The second thing I would say is that thank you for that generous introduction, and somewhere this notion of being an institution builder has become tagged to me. I do realize there, though, that money does play a big role. And so what I've come to the conclusion is that when you're trying to do things for others, one should be greedy. At least that's how I think about it. And shameless. So I'm shameless about asking people for money. And as long as you're not asking for yourself, you can be shameless about it and really greedy about it. So if you're wealthy and you get to know me, you probably don't want to be around me very much. And that's how ISB and Ashoka and Naropa and Vedika have really gotten built. I'm not that independently wealthy to build these on my own money. If I did have the money, I would build my own university, but I don't have that kind of wealth. But I found that the power of being able to collect other people's wealth, aggregate it, and spend it is a unique power that allows me to do things. So Ashoka, for example, is very expensive. A lot of people think of it as a expensive, elite, South Delhi, rich kid school. I think Vanita is here from Ashoka. She would agree, as a dean of students, you face some of that. But what Ashoka also does is probably has the largest scholarship program in the country. And that's what gives you the power to be shameless, the energy to go out there and relentlessly. And I can tell you some of the dinners and lunches and the people you have to suffer. And I'm sure you've all seen that in the fundraising that you do. But a lot of people say, oh, Pramath, you must be a master fundraiser. And I'm actually not. people like Rajat Gupta and Ashish Dhawan, who actually know all the people, rich people are. But I'm a good closer. I'm a guy who can come and close the deal, as it were, because I really literally shame people into saying, what are you going to do with all this money? Come on. You know. So those are the two things that I wanted to share with you. One very deeply personal, as to how at least I feel like I can maintain some level of consciousness in the way you're describing it, and two, much more social and societal in how money has played a role in doing what I'm able to do. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much, sir. Some lines from the mother, which I read, I really feel they apply to you, and I would love to read them. The mother says, one who is capable of attracting this means the money, and using it for something good, to increase the welfare of the world, the welfare and well-being of the world, that man has the hold on the money power. And that is to say, the force that is behind it.
I'll be more shameless.
So then you can... So I think those lines aptly apply to you. I'd like to now invite Mr. Thomas to give his opening.
No. I'm going to use some paper because I will be quoting, and I don't want to make mistakes because most of you know the quotations. Actually, Ritika's leaked out a few. So. Money is an energy to be used or misused, not an evil or something to be avoided. I think you will get resonances from their talks. Both Sri Aurobindo and the mother attached great importance to the role money plays in society. While Sri Aurobindo generally did not touch in his writings on the reality of economic phenomena, he made an exception for money. For instance, in his book, The Mother, he wrote extensively about the correct attitude towards money, be it in a highly spiritual manner. He said, money is the visible sign of a universal force. And this force, in its manifestation on earth, works on the vital and the physical planes and is indispensable to the fullness of outer life. In its origin and its true action, it belongs to the divine. Some even put a ban on money and riches and proclaim poverty and bareness of life as the only spiritual condition. But this is an error. It leaves the power in the hands of the hostile forces. If you're free from the money taint, but without any ascetic withdrawal, you will have a greater power to command the money for the divine work. The mother, while attaching similar spiritual importance to the concept of money, realized that specific guidelines would be required the moment a community of people would need to function in a practical manner. In fact, as early as 1958, she said, one of the most essential powers is the financial power. I have, if anybody would like the quotations, I have this, I'll leave it behind here. She also gave several other indications about how money should be handled. First of all, from the financial point of view, the principle on which our action is based is the following. Money is not meant to make money. The idea that money must make money is a falsehood and a perversion. Money is meant to increase the wealth, the prosperity, the productiveness of a group, a country, or better, of the whole earth. Money is a means, a force, a power, and not an end in itself. And like all forces and powers, it is by movement and circulation that it grows and increases its power. not by accumulation and stagnation. She raised objections to charging interest, both on the supply and demand side. I am not for getting interest on money, she said. And at another time, I am quite against borrowing money, even at reasonable rates of interest. But the mother was very conscious that it might take years, perhaps even hundreds of years, before her and Sri Aurobindo's vision on the true role of money would manifest. What we may call the reign of money is drawing to its close. But the transitional period between the arrangement that has existed in the world till now and the one to come, in 100 years for instance, that period is going to be difficult. It is very difficult. Mother then said money potentially was a divine power in the material world, but currently was in the hands of hostile forces and needed to be won back for the divine. Auroville is the ideal place for those who want to know the joy and liberation of not having any personal possession. At Auroville, nothing belongs to anyone in particular. All is collective property to be utilized with my blessings for the welfare of all. So somebody in 65 asked her some questions, and I just take one or two of them. Will money be used in Auroville? And she said no. Auroville will have money relations only with the outside world. You can ask me about it later, how that's still happening or not happening. How will work be organized and distributed in Auroville? Money would no longer be the sovereign lord. Individual worth would have a far greater importance than that of material wealth and social standing. There, work would not be a way to earn one's living, but a way to express oneself and to develop one's capabilities and possibilities, while being of service to the community as a whole, which, for its own part, would provide for each individual subsistence and sphere of action. In fact, on the Auroville's website, money is not meant to generate money. Money should generate an increase in production, an improvement in the conditions of life, and a progress in human consciousness. Okay. So these are a few of these quotations which I've taken. Like I said, I'll leave the links behind. Talk more.
Thank you, Manuel. And now I'd like Amita to give her opening remarks.
So, I'd like to just talk about some of the challenges, reflections, opportunities that I've had over the years with the force of wealth, the money power, Mahalakshmi, as she is called. I think some of the I think I began again from a very humble background with the father, as Pramath mentioned, in the army and very little money. We had lots of resources, horses and swimming pools and tennis courts, but a meager salary. So I think from my very childhood, it's been very much that money needs to be conserved, needs to be spent thoughtfully, and not just money. I think there were three things my father taught me that I find a resonance in the words of the mother and have been the guiding pillar stones in my own relationship with money. The first, he said to me, is that be conscious of what you have and use it carefully and thoughtfully. So even today, and as a child, he used to make us switch off the fan, switch off the light every time you left a room and you walked in or you walked out. the water, think of how much water you're using. We didn't have, we couldn't afford a battery to run the Jeep, so we would push it and kickstart it, and that's how we started. So simple things, caring for material things, caring for everything that you have as though there is a divine presence in matter. And I think that's become so deeply ingrained in me that whenever I do have the resources, one of the first things I want to do is to create beauty. So, in my life, in the surroundings, in the Gnostic Center, in my house, in the farm, you will see this stamp of beauty. And I think beauty expresses Mahalakshmi. And she is the goddess of wealth. So the first thing is, what do we do with our wealth? What do we do with our money? Do we use it for ourselves and for our own self-aggrandizement? Or do we use it to create something that can be shared by all? That was the first lesson I learned. The second, he told me, and that was when I was much older, and I'd started working with him, he said, never borrow money. Use what you have. If you don't have it, don't do it. So I've kept that very strongly in my consciousness. And often when we've had projects where money has not been there, I said, we won't do it, we'll wait. Or we'll do it in a smaller way. Or, many of these investment bankers, and Monica, this is for you, have been coming to my home to tell me how I should invest, my money. And the first thing they tell me is, listen, don't use your own money. You can do much more with that. Borrow from the bank, the interest rate is only this. It'll treble, look at the markets, what an opportunity. So I'm deeply, since I was last 25, 30 years, been very deeply involved in the markets. And because I've had this in my father's mind, my father told me in the 2001, 2003, the crash of the markets, I don't know how many people came to me and said, this is just double it, treble it. I said, buddy, there's a door, walk out. I'm not doing anything of the sort. I'm not going to borrow anything. I have this much, I will invest it, but I will not borrow. And this has possibly been the greatest advice I've received. Because if you take the power behind money, the force of money, it comes to you for a purpose. It is not there to make more money or to just keep, creating wealth for no reason, because that's when it leaves you. I think the idea that when the force of money is there for a purpose and you are a trustee of it, and therefore the responsibility that one has in that trust, that you are not, does not belong to you, it is there today, it may leave tomorrow. And you are certainly not going to find a way of taking it to heaven. If anyone has, share the secret. And so therefore, what is this wealth for? And what do you want to do with it? These were questions that were deeply, I think in my mind, I was constantly thinking about these. And we'll take those up later, some of the ideas that did come there. The third thing I want to say, and which is the last, is no interest. My father, when he started the farm, there were such, people from Rajasthan, the Saises, the grooms, the staff, from very poor families. They would come here and work. And I remember I was just about 21 years old. And he would tell me, Amita, just see what's happening. I give them their salary, and all of them go to this one shop, and they're paying the interest of the money they've earned, and they've got nothing. So he saw this in the workforce, in the farm. And he said, from now on, if you want money, you will come to me. I will give it to you interest-free. And he told me, never in your life charge anybody interest. Till today, 30 years later, Usha Stud Farm runs in the same way. Anybody of my staff wants money. They come to me and I said, no interest. Then he said, let us start a langar. Let us give free food, free accommodation, because see, all these sharks are taking away their money. So the importance of making sure that the employees that work for you prosper and grow, and their wealth increases, and they prosper, because if they don't prosper, you won't prosper. And this idea that interest is something that is something that we don't need to be. At least in my life, I've kept that as the third cornerstone of the lessons I've learned, and it's always held me in good stead. So with that, I'll stop now. There are several other things, but we'll take them up later.
Any questions anybody has before we go on? Or I do. Okay.
Thank you. Very quickly, a point was made that we have got used to poverty. But that's centuries of overlay, you're right, except that the pristine thing was dharma, arth, kam, moksha. Moksha was actually added on later. Dharma, arth, kam, which means that you should earn money, you must satisfy your desires, except do it in a way which is righteous. I won't go into it. Then it has been said money must not make money. Well, it's like who created the creator? You have to have some original money, right? In order, and you have to make it grow. It's a question of how do you use it. And that is why when Krishna talked in Gita, he talked of lok sangrah and not personal salvation. Because personal salvation is what we had all gone into. But he said, no, lok sangrah. Whatever you do, it has to be done for society. Number 3, daan ke patra. The people you give money to must be worthy of that money. I have plenty of NRIs saying, where should I go? Because people cheat them. So you have to have a place where you can give your money and be sure that it is going to be used properly. And the final question is to you. What is the difference you see between a commune and an Auroville life? I went to a commune. I lived in a commune in Israel for a few days. So what is the difference?
I think the first question was to me on the fact that we have had a tradition of different stages of life, and the last stage is really the renunciation and the. So when you live, so lived experience becomes very different than what either the scriptures or the texts might say. In terms of everyday life, I don't know if people follow that rule in everyday life. Some people like you, evolved, might do it. But, so the point that I was making was not on the stages of life, but more as the background thought that we grow up with. And one example of that is that we tell our children, you should do well. But we don't tell our children, you should be rich. So there is a dichotomy between what we think is at the base of doing well is also wealth. So I don't see the contradiction in having money and doing good. I feel that somewhere as a society we lost that connect. We've associated money with everything that is bad, debauched, evil. And I'm saying money is very good. You choose what you want to do with it. It is entirely up to us how we use it. Are we possessed or do we possess? There's been a very famous case of, like you said, this new wealth. It's coming suddenly, and we're seeing very asuric behavior with people who suddenly have the force. They don't have it. The force has them. So I would just say that it is up to us how we use it. It's an aspiration. And like I think everybody is saying, you're a trustee of that wealth. If you just think of what it can buy for you, there is an end to what it can buy and what you can consume. And to the point that you can't take it with you, yes, you can't, but till the last breath you need it. You need it if you need a hospital bed, you need it if you need an oxygen tank, you need it for everything. So till my last breath, I need the money. And the minute I take my last breath, it doesn't. The shroud has no pockets. It's that balance that I find very interesting, that how do I live today knowing that there is no certainty, I can die tomorrow. What is my relationship today with that money when I might die tomorrow, or I might live to 120, I don't know. Then how do I think about money? What is that balance? So for me personally, it's been those questions, that how do I deal with this?
No, it's a question of poverty consciousness or prosperity consciousness. You know? That's the thing. And the fact is that it's not just in India, no? Everywhere. You had Weber who said that, the Christian work ethic made people do very well. So, and Protestants particularly, Protestant countries, they did very well because when you did well and you earned wealth and all that, it meant that God is blessing you. Okay. So, in the Catholic countries, I'm Catholic, so, wealth was a kind of source of guilt. If you had money, you felt bad about it. So it's a question of consciousness, basically. So that's the thing. Your question to me was about the kibbutz and the thing, See, I haven't lived in a kibbutz, but would you like to answer that? Yeah.
So
I think so,
I'm going to request everybody, to hold on to your questions, and let me just throw some questions at the panelists and get some answers, and then you can ask your questions. So these 3 questions that I'm throwing to all the 4 panelists. Any one of you can answer, or 2 of you can answer. What does money mean to you? That's a question to all 4 of you. Any of you can. I'll throw 3 questions, and then the second question, what is your relationship with money? And the third, how does one develop a conscious relationship with money? So who? Yeah. Okay, so why don't you, Amita, start with how does one? Okay. What does money mean to you, Dr. Sinha?
You can call me Pramath.
Okay.
It's a very deep question. I thought I tried to answer a bit of that. Now you're putting me on the spot. Yeah, I think I would say that to me, what I earn, so money is very personal. I'm not talking about money in an abstract way, but personally to me, the money that I make or I earn is in a way a result or a produce of my work and my efforts. I'm very focused on my work and what I do, and brought up with a very strong work ethic. So I feel like it's something I'm producing. And I do feel very strongly that the trustee idea appeals to me a lot, that it's all transient. I have seen money come and go. I've seen people lose everything. So I feel like in the time I have, I should deploy it and put it to good use. So, and I do think that I've seen people, and all of us have, but I've been very struck by when people die, everybody just kind of forgets about them or what happens to their wealth. And I've seen cousins and nephews and nieces fight over wealth and property and assets, and it just seems so dysfunctional. So I would like not to leave too much behind for anybody to fight over. Fortunately, I don't have children, so I don't worry about that, but I don't want to leave the money for other people to fight over after I'm gone, even if it's not my family members. So that's how I think about it. That you work hard, you, through the working hard, you produce something, but try and deploy it quickly. Keep some for the hospital bed, which is always difficult to estimate.
Yes.
But yeah, that's my quick take on it.
Actually, when I was listening to you, one example that comes to me, and I was struck by it when the first time I got to know about it, was the Auroville model, that nobody owns anything over there. So even if you invest over there in a property, it after you, it goes back to the foundation. It doesn't go back to your heirs. Is that so?
No, the children can stay so long as they are there.
They stay, but they don't own it.
Live somewhere else and use it as a...
And they can use it, but they don't own it. So I think that's something that I personally subscribe to. And so, what is your relationship with money? Would you like?
Tough one, relationship with money. I write about it, I breathe it, I advise people, you should definitely write a will and get your nominations in place. Free advice, if you have no kids. So personally, the way that I see it is that I think it gives me choices. Having money personally is important to me. I do want to own it, and it allows me choices to do what I want. Money also is something that gets you out of toxic places for a lot of people. I think it has the power to allow you to live the life that you want to live. So over and over, my relationship with money is one of using it like I would use electricity or a Wi-Fi. I use it and I switch it off judiciously, but I use it. It doesn't use me. That is all that I can say, that it is a very powerful force, and I would like to be the one using it. And the way that I use it is a reflection of who I am. And it's very important to me how I earn my money. From what source is it coming? That is extremely important. There are things that I will not do even if there's a lot of money coming. So I speak, I have commercial workshops. In the last few months, there was a lot of money coming to me just to moderate a cryptocurrency session because somewhere they thought it might give it legitimacy. I will not do it. So it's important to me how I earn it. It's also important how I spend it. It's a reflection of who I am. That's my relationship.
No, I'll just continue on that thing. See, I'm a chartered accountant, okay? So you might say that I have an intimate relationship. Most of the time it is trying to help people retain most of it. There are people trying to take it away. So that's the thing. But the point is that to me personally, there was a kind of moment where the whole thing fell into place. I had a friend who was suddenly diagnosed with cancer, okay, and in 3 months' time, he was gone. So I was meeting him regularly, and over that 3 months, I realized, whatever we are doing, something like this is going to happen, and nothing you can't take away anything. So that kind of gave me a kind of rude shock, because till then, I was doing all the things that everybody does, but that was the kind of awakening. What was the other?
Amita, I'd like to throw this question at you. How does one develop a conscious relationship with money?
So firstly, I think it's important to understand how consciously we live our lives. How conscious are we in understanding and reflecting on the choices we make in our life. I've seen that, when one is unconscious, one tends to use money for vital satisfaction, to buy yourself something, to do this, to do that. And after a while, you see that when you buy something or you purchase something for yourself or your family, most of us look at money as a very personal possession. And I think that is part of the unconsciousness. Because as long as you look at money as a personal possession, it tends to possess you. When you can look at money impersonally, as a force that is there in the universe, that you can open yourself to, that you can come into relationship with, but you need not allow it to you need not allow ownership of it. I think this ownership is something that we need to deeply become conscious of, because it's the very nature of money. It's the one thing, when we come to money, you see all of us, our true natures come out. The smallness, the meanness, the withholding of it. And yet, when we want to spend it on ourselves, we do it with great liberality. And we never think that it might not be enough. And that, we are spending too much. We can give and spend for ourselves very liberally and for our children. But how do we do that when it comes to the other? Whether it's society, whether it's whatever, something that is not related to yourself. So this ownership of money is something, the first point of becoming conscious. The second point that I have experienced and felt is to understand and that there is no lack, there is no, what should I say? There is no lack of money, because it's a force, you see. So when you understand and you have developed this conscious relation with it as an impersonal force, and not ownership of it or ownership, because you actually, then it owns you, then you realize that there is no lack of money to do anything. And when you realize the plenitude that brings to your consciousness, then your whole consciousness changes. You begin to see things differently. You begin to have, pray almost, you could say. Often I pray to the Divine Presence. Tell me what I should do. Let me not be unconscious in my actions, or even in giving money, and even in receiving money. These are very important things. See, we must be open to a higher power that then begins to almost purify our own consciousness and our own relationship. So the sadhana aspect, if you want to be a true trustee of money, and you want to be a recipient and a channel for it, then you need to become more conscious about how you use it, what it does to you, what your thoughts are, your unconscious thoughts. Become more conscious of those. Then only can you start developing a conscious relationship with money.
I was just... do you all want a tea break because we were supposed to have it, or should we continue? Okay. So, I have a few more questions. So I have a few more questions. Sir, I think I'll ask you another question. I know you've said I can take your first name, but I'm a bit uncomfortable. So I'd like to refer to you as sir. What is the difference between creating wealth and getting rich?
I think that one was already answered, right? So, I mean, at least the way I interpret it is getting rich is just about yourself, and creating wealth is being a trustee of whatever you generate. So at least I'm no expert, so I don't know if there's a right answer here, but that's how I think about it.
You want your personal view?
Yeah, no, so the personal view is that, yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, against 10,000 rupees a month, I'm very rich. But I see it more as wealth that I can use and put to good use, and that's really how. Go ahead.
I just wanted to mention one other thing, that you know, whenever one feels that one has not got enough,
Yeah.
it creates a certain, I think it almost creates a certain, what should I say, wall, you know, you.
Oh, yeah. There's no end. By the way, you have a very intimidating style of asking questions, so I get tongue-tied a bit there. But, no, I'm joking. But I think wealth goes beyond money, no? So that's the other thing I would say, that for me, wealth is, this conversation is also generating wealth. It may not qualify as making me more, I mean, it does make me richer in a larger context, but I think wealth to me has many more dimensions than just money.
If I may answer the Aurovillian.
So now can I ask you one question on Auroville?
No, the same question. You know, in Auroville.
How does he get all the easy questions about what he knows?
I just add on. You do the heavy lifting. I just add on.
No,
It's just the same question.
no, I'm joking.
In Auroville, the surplus generating units generate surpluses for the benefit of Auroville. So it's different from, you generate surpluses generally in the outside world for yourself, and then you try to keep as much of it as you can. Like I said, there are people. Okay, so in here, the Aurovillian entrepreneur works not for himself. He works for the community, the society of Auroville. It's far more difficult than, it's easier said than done, because whatever you do, what you get is a maintenance or slightly better, because you're a unit, so there are other expenses that will be, utilized, used up there. But otherwise, all the motivation is self. There's no one coming and telling you, why don't you do better? Nothing. It's the self-motivation and the fact that you're working for the common good. So it's a different thing in itself. You have no control over that money, except that it's sitting in your pocket. It's very funny. You have your bank account, the money is there, but you're a trustee. You don't own it.
Before we go on, in this context, I'd like to ask a specific question on Auroville. What are some of the things that stand out? You've done a lot of research on Auroville's economy, so I'd like to know, what are some of the things that stand out, and can they be implemented on a wider scale in the outside world or the economy?
Auroville is like a lab, so experimentation has been going on over the last 50 years. One of the things that they did was this no money concept. Okay, they had these circles. First, you had a circle where people joined and contributed a sum of money monthly, and that went towards buying stuff from Pondicherry, because Pondi is the nearest town. So they would buy toothpaste and things like that, and would be distributed here. Okay, some of those circles continue to this day. Then they started something called the Porto's Distribution Center, where again you contributed monthly amounts. So some people contributed more Some people contributed less. And you were allowed to go into that store, which was provisions, okay, food and provisions. You could take whatever you wanted. You would not be billed for it. But they would keep an account of what you took. And at no hoarding, because you would only take what you needed for that month, you know. So, and then they would tell you, look, you are spending far more than what you have contributed. That's fine if you are not contributing more, but it's okay because somebody else is spending far less. So that circle works, you know. And that has now got 2,500 members. And it had to be closed because there wasn't space. You know, so now they're trying to open other locations and work longer hours. So it's quite interesting to see how they have worked on no money, but the fact remains, all that means is there's no money in your pocket like cash, but it still means that you're using something called a debit card. We use a debit card here. But they use something, you know, they have an account in a financial service, which is a group thing. And they would, you know, if you went to the bakery, they would mention the account number and it would get reduced from your, okay, let me just say that an Aurovillian is allowed 20,000 rupees a month as maintenance, of which 10,000 is given to you in cash and 10,000 is in kind, which means that you can spend at various locations and use this number. So you would go to the bakery and buy things and give your number, and that's it. Just sign and walk away and thing. The point is that the money that they had, the 20,000, is extremely small in the outside world. Okay, but the fact is that they can do what they're doing because of these circles. So out of this 20,000, you contributed 3,500 for this and 2,500 for that, and it gave you quite a bit of leeway. It's the what you call the you know, the frivolous bits that you, and the travel that you can't do, because you want to travel, it takes far more. But otherwise, you can actually live.
We can live for our needs, but not for the greed that.
Correct. Yeah.
Well maintained, are they audited?
Let's see. It is audited. No. I'm saying in a lab, there, you know, in an experimental area, there will be always pluses and minuses. But the fact is, it is audited locally by chartered accountants, and it is audited by the C&AG after that. So you have two audits.
What do people do when they have to travel? I've seen Auroville people traveling.
True, but some of them are supported by their units, and some of them collectively raise money. I want to travel, and then people pull in and give them the funding.
Contrary to what Salam was saying, that is how you spend your money.
Huh.
I mean, that's the concept of how you spend your money. So here you don't have any control over how you spend it.
You do. You have the control over your 10,000 a month. That's exactly what he said.
You can manage, that's the point, you know. I thought, you know, when I'm doing the research, I'll just finish this thought, I'll come to you. No, when I was doing this research, I thought that 20,000 is too little. You know, it's something that I pay my, anyway. But then when I went in there and I actually did the math and found out how people managed, okay. So I found out that because of these circle systems, there's a free store. There's a free store where you can pick up garments, you know, and walk away. You don't have to pay anything. You can give some money, but you can walk. Like that, there are possibilities there which don't exist outside. That's the difference.
What I'm trying to say is you can't do any good with your money. You can only live off it.
See, the work that they do is phenomenal. She asked me, I went somewhere else, sorry. The work that they do, for example, ecology, water conservation, there's a lot of scientific research there. You can't imagine the kind of things. You know, they've done a lot of work on soil conservation, water conservation, pollution, a lot of work, and effective microorganisms, for example, use of that. So there are a lot of takeaways from Auroville which can be replicated. In Chennai, you have a park which was the eco-restoration of the Adyar River, entirely done by Auroville Consulting, Pichandikulam Forest Consultants.
The next question, Monica, can I throw to you is, what personification would you give money?
You asked me earlier, and I have been really struggling with it, personification of money. So the only answer that I could find within myself is when you get this feeling of abundance, and it doesn't have to be money as in rupees or dollars or euros, it is a feeling of abundance that you get out of, say, a conversation like this, or a beautiful room, or a flower, or the personification of money happens when, for instance, you help somebody without any, like you were saying, no interest. And the interest needn't be just money, it can be work to be done. So it is when you, out of a moment where there is an opportunity and you find yourself doing something, there is, I don't know what the scientific word for it, but there is a release of something which I can only quantify as, name it as abundance. And that has nothing to do with how much money I have in my bank account. So the personification for me is just this feeling of abundance.
There was, my own experience has been, sometimes I call it the happy money, when you are able to bring happiness to somebody, and it automatically gives you that happiness. It need not be in terms of giving money, but even a small act of kindness. I think that is when I say that it is something happy, and it is happy money because it has given somebody else happiness. So that's, for me, that's the personification I would give to it, as happy money or something.
I also want to say the opposite of that, because in my business life I have my competitors and various other people. You think that, my God, he could kill us. We are ants, compared to their wealth and resources. And yet the deprivation, the lack of contentment, the unhappiness, and the bitter fights between the children and the families and the health issues, you wonder, what is this? What is this? And it really made me reflect that, one shouldn't have too much. That itself is something you have to be very vigilant about. And what I mean by too much is greed. You keep stuffing it in, And there was a time that, when my parents died, I had something that somebody had left for me. And it was an inner instinct. I said, I shouldn't touch this. Give it away. And I immediately put it into an endowment fund and used it and just said, donation, gone. So you have to, that is an inner balance that you have to keep moving between yourself to see where you are. And that is the consciousness that we need to get.
Sri Aurobindo said, that the three things, power, money and sex, which are the problems that we face. And he said it that many years ago. Point is, maybe you should introduce Mehta to him. You should.
Let me tell you what he does. He goes to he goes for the dinner with his trainers, and he says, they order orange juice. He says, I don't want to order too much. You give me half your orange juice. Looking at him, but I want to have the orange juice myself. No. He's a miser to the ultimate. But he won't give him anything. He doesn't believe in charity.
So the next question, so I'm throwing again at you, is how do you use money to create educational institutions of excellence? How do you, in the beginning you did say that you create how you approach, but how are you able to attract that money and use it to create?
Yeah, I think that one I can speak about. Thank you. That was an easy question. What I've found is that most of the people I know who made money are very grateful for the education they got and feel like that's an area they would like to contribute back to. And like you mentioned or somebody mentioned that they want to work with people who they can trust. So whenever people want to donate funds, so the kind of philanthropic funds that we raise, trust is a very important aspect because a lot of people do operate foundations and trusts, but even through that they get personally rich. And that way, making sure that you clearly communicate or build that trust and credibility that, hey, this money is not going to go to Pramat's pocket. So the fact that I have other sources of income also naturally helps me because people know that I'm not going to. This is something I can disclose, which I'm just talking about for the first time, but from a CA perspective, I have never drawn a single reimbursement even from ISB or Ashoka, just for that reason. We hold a very high bar that even for if I'm traveling on their behalf, I just pay for it. So I think that is the first thing you do. You put a very strong bar, and I do say that I'm fortunate that I have other sources of income, so I don't need to. I teach at Ashoka. Other people who are teaching or associated will get paid. I won't charge. I won't take the money. So these are simple things you do to keep that credibility, the line very clean. At McKinsey, we had a legendary founder, Marvin Bauer, who used to say that it's the perception of conflict that is conflict. So you don't even want to have a perception of conflict. Yeah. The second thing is that people like to be associated with projects of excellence. So it doesn't have to be elite or rich or, but they want to see some element of distinctiveness and excellence. They want to associate with something high quality. So that I've figured out in education. I can talk more about it, but I have a little bit of a formula of how you create high quality, which I'm not getting into unless you want to, but credibility with high quality then attracts people to what you're doing. And then finally, the fact that you are going to use that money for really making sure it goes to the people who need it most, right? And not gold plating the buildings or spoiling already privileged students and so on. And demonstrating that you are doing that. And it's a tricky game because demonstrating means highlighting that I got this poor kid from Tamil Nadu and got them a job or placed them at Harvard, means sometimes opening up about that person in a public way, but you have to do it in a sensitive way so that you're not kind of tom-tomming the fact that, oh, I'm doing great thing for these poor kids from Tamil Nadu. But I think demonstrating that to the donors quietly to further establish your credibility becomes the third leg. But I think that's how you do it. And I think it's probably true for most projects, but at least in education, those are three things you are very focused on. Your personal credibility, your commitment to excellence and high quality, and third, making sure that the money is going to the right person, channel.
So now I'm going to open questions to the audience. Yes.
for your comments. I want to also explore a little bit the aspects of taxation, because taxation, is one area which can convert your good money into also black money because of greed, largely. And I mean, there is this whole thing about taxation for greater good, and there is that aspect of both accountability from the government side as well as from the citizens' side. I mean, seeking accountability and being accountable. So I would, because that becomes it's a huge issue in our society. Does it stop greater good aspects? So I would really, and particularly, you would have something to say about it. So I would like panelists to comment on that. And also my question is specifically for Auroville on taxation, because you did mention that there are some really well-doing businesses. How do, and then they're using that resource for greater good to do, research and other stuff. How do they deal with taxation?
See, the first thing is the mistake that we make. Hello? Can you hear? Okay. The first thing that we make is we treat tax as an evil, If you treat tax as an expense, then you will manage it. You need to do the optimum amount of tax, not the highest amount, not the least amount, the optimum taxation. You can use legally available methods like depreciation and, investments in various areas to reduce it, but whatever it comes to, pay it. I'll give you an example. I had a client who came from the Middle East. He was a very big doctor. I mean, he's one of the leading doctors in Chennai today. When he came back, his wife came over and said, somebody brought him to engage me. So he said, what should I do? I said, look, you're used to being in a place with no tax. They were coming from Saudi. They had worked in those places for many years, and they're coming here. I said, the first thing is, treat tax as an expense. If you do that and pay it, you can sleep peacefully. Otherwise, you will always be waiting for somebody to knock on your door. And believe you me, it's 25 years now. Okay, they have grown really, because when you pay your taxes, your balance sheets become, lendable. No, you can borrow, you can grow, you can continuously do that, because you are showing your income. And you don't have to worry about people stealing from you, because what happens generally is that if you, as the boss, are doing this black money, you can be certain that all the way down, people are doing all, So if you treat tax as an expense, and that's made very clear, you will pay your employees better. Because the money is otherwise going elsewhere, so you would, staff welfare, all of these things become far better. Okay, now coming to the Auroville point of view, the Auroville is a body corporate set up by Act of Parliament and has exemptions under 1023 and 80G and all that. So the surplus generating units are under the same umbrella. So the surpluses are internally transferred. It's not from an outside unit, pay tax and then generate and then donate whatever you can. It's not like that. Here it is surplus generating units. The money is used for the collective, for the city services, for the maintenances and so on. So that's why there is no tax on that. It's not after tax, it's before.
I'll just take one. So as a society, again, we've been reluctant to pay income tax, and that reflects in the personal income tax to GDP ratio, which is, as compared to, say, a US or a Germany, it's very low. There has been a culture of non-tax paid money in the country, but that is changing. It's changing very fast. So exactly as he's saying that we need to treat it as an expense, it's something that we all have to do. Because once you ride the black money tiger, and typically it happens in gold and property now, very difficult to get out of it. So it's that one hard, you bite the bullet of doing white deal in real estate once, and then you are in the clean part of the market. And again, if you invest judiciously, you really get back what the tax that you have paid. So I think as a society, as we are now moving towards larger share of the GDP of the country, we'll be the third largest in a few years. We're already the fifth, sixth largest now. So there's a formalization happening, and we're all part of that formalization. So in our individual spaces, we have to understand that the taxes that we pay will get used into things like healthcare, education, infrastructure. So the government has to get the money from somewhere. And it will come from household taxation, personal income, corporate taxation, GST. So it's a fact of life. We have to get used to it.
Even if you're paying with tax.
One more question.
I really don't have a question. I have some thoughts which I would like to share with reference to what Amita mentioned, and key concepts like field force and consciousness. Yeah. Now, what I would like to mention here is, now if we just step aside from the personal choices or a small commune kind of choices and the economy which is operating, now if you look at nation-state level economic systems and the way they have evolved over the last 200 years from pastoral mercantile systems, where some of these concepts, they had resonance, and where there was no borrowing in the economy, and there was no concept of money like that. Now when we moved to about last 200 years, particularly around the start of industrial revolution around 1700 plus, and the way economies have evolved, and particularly during last 75 years after World War II, and particularly over 100 years, 125 years, 100 years before that, they are totally fueled and founded by concept of borrowing, concept of a labor surplus, and as an accumulated capital. And the entire thing has been fueling all the aspirations of all kinds of poor, middle and upper people to join in that game, and been evolving. Now we have come to a crisis, of course, and everybody might have heard the name Thomas Piketty, who talks about where is this, the idea of surplus, labor surplus, capital surplus, where is it going to lead to? What kind of madness is going to go to? So while we're discussing all this, of course, that's a big topic, but from that point of view, consciousness, field force, I think we have to build some thoughts around it on some of these bigger issues. Of course, they're far more complex issues. In the pre-nation-state economic systems, those issues did not exist. Pastoral, mercantile kind of economies. So that's just sharing some high-level comments. Of course, they're too complex and probably not fit for discussion here. I'm just sharing that. Thank you very much.
One more question. Sunil, your question. Okay, so we have to,
one more. There's 2, 3 of them. Why don't you take all the questions and then...
let's take...
So otherwise,
Hi, this is for Pramath. You've been known to set up some iconic institutions in the country, ISB and Ashoka. And one of the things we heard on the periphery outside is that the endowment fund for Ashoka was an iconic, super large fund of over $1 billion. So my question is about when you're setting up institutions of excellence, is it important to have those kind of endowment funds? Because you really, when you're struck for profits in the beginning, like you've invested a lot, you didn't have a large fund at the back of an institution, you're going to be stuck at taking in students or people or staff that's not probably the best. And by doing that large fundraise, you made sure that you go in with all force, do all the things that excellence requires. So what's the formula there? Because a lot of people just get started and then
I'll tell you the formula. Yeah, I got the question. Maybe we can...
maybe one more question and then we can take your question.
We are talking about money. I just want to ask, anybody can answer. The ethical dilemmas which come on your way to the work. A personal situation I faced, I just wanted to share. I have taken a conscious decision after my retirement from the army to go back to my village and create a model natural farm over there. First thing I realized was water. Rainwater harvesting came to my mind. I am from Bihar. We have about 1300 millimeters of rainfall over there, but from February to May, we find water shortage. Even drinking water is a problem. So I realized that digging ponds is perhaps a solution for rainwater harvesting. Then somebody told me that government gives subsidy, and Soil Conservation Department is giving 80% subsidy. I said, fine. I contacted the person. He said, okay, aap Dashera ke baad baat karna. And he was kind of avoiding me. So a friend of mine told me he's avoiding you because he thinks that he will not get the 25% share which he is used to getting. When I got to know, then I was in a big dilemma whether to go for it. I asked all my friends and mentors, what should I do? And the answers came from, ranged from one friend of mine. He said, if I were in your place, I wouldn't have taken it. And somebody said that sit in meditation and whatever answer comes to your mind, do that. Don't think of right or wrong. I would want to know from you, what should one do in such situations? If your intent is good, to do good to the environment, society around you, and you need that subsidy money to be able to do good, basically.
So now let's just take the three questions. Pramath, perhaps you would like to answer the second question and then Monica could answer.
I can quickly take the second one also, and others can add to it. I can tell you that my answer can be quite different depending on the context, and I won't get into the business context. I'll stick to the answer to your context, but I can tell you that in 25 years of building institutions, I have taken the path that if you are doing things with good intent, then you don't need to break away from that and do anything unethical. In fact, I feel much surer that I will not do anything that goes away from the straight and narrow as far as ISB, Ashoka, any of these institutions are concerned, and that has stood me in really good stead. I don't know if you know, but ISB is a 20-year-old institution that is not accredited by the Indian government. And that's because the very first time I went to the AICTE, which by that time was headed by an IIT director, former IIT director, and I knew him, and the subcommittee approving management institutions were headed by a management professor who I personally knew. He was from Bihar. He was a Sinha, same caste, lots of connections. They couldn't help me because the officials wanted money. They actually asked me for 1 crore in 1995. By then, Harshad Mehta and all were on the horizon, so crore had become a good number to ask for. I refused to give the money, and we still don't have accreditation. And today the government offers us accreditation, and I don't take it. So I do think that at least my experience is, and I'm not trying to tell you what to do, if you're doing something good, then just stick to that. Don't compromise. I mean, I'm dealing with a huge case right now where a bureaucrat in Haryana has recommended the case of a student who's a friend's son, and we are not able to accept, and he's really coming after us. And this is, by the way, an Ashoka parent. His daughter went to Ashoka. He knows how it works. He comes from a UPSC civil service system where you can't influence admissions. And he's going hammer and tongs after us. And we are saying, listen, you do what you have to do, but we have done this cleanly right from the beginning. We will not depart. So that's one thing I would say. Quickly on the endowment part, we don't have an endowment, by the way. And we did not start, we still don't have $1 billion. I don't know if that was what you meant, million or billion. We do have more than million. We don't have $1 billion. Interestingly, when we started the university, a lot of people told me that we couldn't do it, that we did need $1 billion endowment. I can tell you that we started the university with the first check of 8.5 lakhs that my friend Frank Hancock at Barclays Bank wrote for me in a meeting. We've always built Ashoka and ISB with very small ticket sizes to build that credibility over time. What you do is you start small, but you don't start small on quality. So what you just said that, you end up hiring people or taking people and then quality doesn't scale. Numbers scale, but we make the mistake of thinking that chota shuru karenge or second tier, third tier quality chalega and over time usko first grade banayenge. Hoga nahi. Aapke life mein nahi hoga. So you have to start at quality level 1 and numbers you can scale, but quality will not scale, if you know what I mean. So you start at high quality, you figure out how much money you need to create the minimum scale at the topmost quality that is possible, and how much money do you need for that. So the way we started Ashoka was we started with a Young India Fellowship program, 60 students, rented campus, Sri Aurobindo Center for Arts and Communication, and in fact the hall for the classroom was like this with the mother and Sri Aurobindo's pictures there, and we costed the program out. It was 8 lakhs a student, and so we went to 50 people and said, give me 50 checks, and that's how Ashoka started. But that was a top-notch quality class with top-notch students, and that's how you start to scale up. Today, we are now going to start building an endowment. Our endowment is the buildings and the land. So, when you're building an institution in the building, there's no point putting money in an endowment. You need the infrastructure. So this is now an endowment, right? This is an endowment in kind, which then will be there for 100 years. So that's what you focus on. Once you get the whole thing running, then you start building the cash endowment, which is a much more a Western model, which we are trying to also meet. Does that answer your question?
Just to answer Soumendra, your question, not answer, but so I would look at it as a consequence. So the idea that I don't want to bribe will always have consequences. The idea that I will not pay black money when I buy my house, and this is a personal story. So we decided, we don't have, why will I turn my white into black? And this is 15 years ago. So we had to wait for many years, and the property prices doubled and tripled in front of our eyes. But you take these decisions according to your own moral code. And that is not a reflection on anybody else. So it doesn't matter if somebody else is paying. I will not have a comment on him or her. This is how we do it. And you take the consequences, which meant a long wait, which means more tax. But that is how we do it, and it stood us in very good stead. Because for you, maybe the word will also go out that this one doesn't compromise.
I'll give you an institutional example. We had an institution, a large trust, which was approached by people and saying that we'll give you a large donation. Okay, I'll give you a large donation, and they always talk in numbers which I can't comprehend, huge numbers, 100 crores, 50 crores. They just throw it at you. But out of that 50 crores, 50%, we want that back.
Commission.
Yeah. What do? So this group came, and we went and met these people and tried to move them into, we are doing, doing all these great things, and, why do you want this kind of money? But they were adamant, and we said, look, we can't do it, and walked away. The point is that you always have a choice. Do it, and then, if we had done that, we would have been vulnerable after that. Completely. Because don't think that these fellows who got the 50% are going to keep quiet about it. They're going to tell somebody else and come back. So it's not what you can do with the 50%. I can do so many things. We had internal arguments where some people said, we can do great things with this 50%, such a huge amount of money. And finally...
we'll take 2 more questions. Why don't you... The girl at the back.
Thank you. I just want to narrate, it's not a question really, but just something that I feel. COVID was a wake-up call for me with regard to importance of personal wealth. That's when I realized you don't know how much is too much. Because I know a very close acquaintance, they spent around 2 crores trying to save their mother, shifting the mother from one hospital to another hospital. And obviously they became, they thought they were having sufficient money, but eventually they were not having too much money, and the mother died also, unfortunately. I know families, so there was a period of time for 7 days in Delhi. Oxygen concentrators were selling at 10 times the price. Many families couldn't afford it, and they lost loved ones. So we don't know what life has in store for us. So we should never think money is not important and personal wealth, accumulating personal wealth is wrong, simply because you don't know what life has in store. And I have a very close friend. She's not able to hire the best divorce lawyers for fighting her divorce case because she's not having enough money. So she's having to settle for less. So we don't know how much is too much. So I think having personal wealth, or what people call accumulation of personal wealth, I don't think it's something wrong because you don't know how much is too much. And another thing regarding spending on, spending lavishly on yourself or on your children or whatever, and we see businessmen doing that, industrialists doing that, and we don't like it. We say, oh, it's so wrong. But when you're spending, you are helping the economy, like you're helping the flower seller, you are helping the person who puts up the pandal, you are helping the caterer on income, you are helping the caterers staff like the cooks, the servers, the waiters, all these small town boys, you are helping them become richer. So spending lavishly is not something so bad, because yeah, if you don't spend, if it's all with you, then yeah, that is a different topic. But I don't think spending lavishly on yourself is so wrong, because you're helping someone else become rich.
Would any of you want to respond to that?
Why don't we get more?
Okay. Smriti, just okay.
Okay, I just wanted to mention that Hemant is an Aurovilian of 50 years there or so. He should also share a little bit of his, ideas and his experience of living. That's one. Two is the means and the ends. Are we saying that the means matter as much as the ends do? And the other question is, when you build an institution, do you compromise for the larger good? So these are some of the questions that I have.
नमस्कार आप सभी को। मैंने आपकी बातों को सुना और यहाँ के सवालों को भी सुना, और कुछ चिंतन है मेरे मन में, तो मैं वो आप सबके सामने रखूंगी। एक तो पैसे को जब हम देखते हैं तो ऊर्जा मैं देखती हूँ, ऊर्जा को जब देखती हूँ तो साधन देखती हूँ, साध्य देखती हूँ, साधना देखती हूँ। लेकिन मेरा सवाल ये कि अर्थशास्त्र क्या है फिर? अगर पैसे की बात कर रहे हैं हम, और इन्होंने भी बहुत, ये महिला जो हमारे साथ हैं, इन्होंने बहुत अच्छी बात कही। मैंने प्रयोग की तरह अपने जीवन को देखा है और परिवार के रूप में मैंने प्रयोग किया, तो मेरे समझ जो बने हैं, और वो प्रयोग ये था कि मैं गिफ्ट कल्चर और ट्रस्ट कल्चर पे क्या परिवार के साथ घूम सकती हूँ, और वो गिफ्ट कल्चर क्या है, तो गिविंग इन फुल ट्रस्ट, और ट्रस्ट कल्चर क्या है, टू रिसीव यूनिवर्सल सॉलिडारिटी एंड टुगेदरनेस। तो ये अर्थशास्त्र मेरे लिए एक प्रयोग का एक साधन बना, और इसके द्वारा मेरे प्रयोग में एक नया आयाम खड़ा हो गया, और जहाँ पे मैं अर्थ को निरर्थक नहीं देखती हूँ अब, लेकिन कितना चाहिए उसकी एक समझ है, और क्या मैं कंट्रोल करती हूँ अपने जीवन को और कितना कंट्रोल करूँगी। तो ये सारी बातें, और मेरा सवाल यही कि अर्थशास्त्र की परिभाषा क्या है?
Preeti?
Hello, everyone. So my question is to Dr. Sinha, and it's something I'm struggling with at this point of my life. You said that you, for your Ashoka University, you did not take any reimbursements because you have other sources. So that means some sources of incomes were created earlier than this venture. So then we come back to this point of creating certain wealth for self. So now you can go freely to do what you want to do without wondering where the money would come.
Hello. I'm going back to the initial discussion on the personal relationship with money and the consciousness. And the recent discussion about how much money is necessary, we need it. So it comes down to me for money being abstract or money being literal. When it comes to money being literal, it comes down to the fear that we have, that how much money I need if I fall ill or something. So my question is regarding that relationship between fear, money, and its literal sense. That's my question.
I'd like to first congratulate the Gnostic Center for coming up with this topic, a very important topic for all of us. And we generally don't kind of come up with sessions on money. I'm just expressing a concern as an educationist. Because I run a school, and for me, I'm looking at money in terms of what the goals of education is today. What is the essential goals of schools and educational institutions today? Is it purely that what I see around is that it is all driven by the employability of what education can provide, rather than a kind of an integral development that Mother and Trevindra talk about of an individual? So the perception of money, it's like, basically center of gravity. Today, I think I just overheard you speaking about how at a certain point of time in India, the center of gravity was in terms of acquiring knowledge. And the teachers of knowledge were the ones who used to be looked up to. And that was the real point of gravity there. Today, it is purely making money. So here, my concern and my dilemma is about the ethics of money in that sense, because money is more perceived in terms of a lifestyle which every boy and girl from the village or the town or the city is actually aspiring for. So education now is completely turning around providing for that, and that is what is creating a lot of conflict, ethical conflict in society. So what all of you have said is wonderful, because I think it is possible to deliberate upon what you have been discussing after having achieved a certain amount of comfort, or to be able to speak about money in a certain sense. But the aspirations of millions of youth today and millions of children is just to acquire that lifestyle, which is an affluent lifestyle, which is going to be purely indulgence, personal indulgence. So there's no clarity about. I really appreciate what you said. At the end of the day, money does make you to enable having choices, which is the true thing. But the problem is they don't know what the choices is going to be all about. Right now, it is purely the comfort of what money is going to bring them. So it is completely clouded. The perception is clouded, and it's affecting educational institutions in a massive way. So the entire goals of education is being undermined. Thank you.
So now the panelists.
So may I take two of the questions, and then others can address some of the other ones. So I would like to take your question, ma'am, and say that I did mean it in a very personal context. And yes, I think you have to first take care of yourself before you start building institutions. I have been fortunate enough to have had a career through which I am able to live my life and not have to earn through these institutions. But there are enough people who also build institutions which they earn from or live off, or earn enough to just. And there I think you just have to be explicit. The question was in that context from a donor perspective, and I think it's important to understand that it's not like donors won't give you money if you are also, but you have to be very explicit that this is how much I am paying myself and no more. But if you are on one hand saying you are doing something and doing something else, or driving expensive cars, or flying business class on a NGO budget, then obviously people start to lose the trust in you. So I think being very explicit and being doubly explicit and setting expectations about what you are going to benefit directly is very important to build the same kind of trust as I was talking about. I think, ma'am, on this issue of education, if I may, I face this dilemma all the time. I have to admit that having gone through individual cases of students, forget about people who might be doing it just for the money or just because they want to do something. There are people who need a job in this country, and I feel I have an obligation to them as an educator. I think far too long education has tried to see it as a trade-off or a dichotomy. I don't see it as that. I think I can educate people for knowledge. I can have faculty and teachers who don't have to be conflicted at all. They should actually inspire students. They should build their knowledge. They should do their holistic development. And if my education is good enough, then those students will find outcomes, whether it is to go and study more or get a job, and that's my obligation too. So I do tell people who are part of our institutions that you have a dual obligation. You have an obligation to educate and do all of the great, inspirational, noble things that you have to do. So you have to do the noble bit and you have to do the able bit. You have to make them noble and you have to make them able. And the able bit also you have an obligation and to deliver that. Vinita Shastri is here, and she leads our global engagement team, and she knows that I'm very bullish about saying, hey, are our students getting into the best universities? Forget about jobs for a minute. If money, what about making sure that we are getting our students into the best PhD programs, into the best master's program, into the best social enterprises? So I do think that educational institutions, at least in the Indian context, where students need jobs. I was just on the way here counseling a young woman who was on a full scholarship to Ashoka. I didn't know that. She works for me. And she had called me to help ask for my counsel on her brother. I didn't know, but she's the daughter of a single mother in Chandigarh who works for BSNL. And now the brother has to go to college, and she says, listen, he's got into these colleges, but these colleges don't offer scholarship. What should I do? And I'm the one who's the breadwinner because my mother is suffering from some illness and can't. So I can't not feel the obligation to make sure that they are on a path of financial independence while giving them a good education. So I think even in school education, we have to think about this as not a trade-off or an either-or, but our obligation is to do both in the right way. I hope that's helpful. Thank you.
So I'd like to respond to what he said, fear and money, and also in a way that does come to what you were saying about how much is enough, and can we really know what is enough and for ourselves. And also this idea about when you spend lavishly on yourself, then you actually, a lot of people are benefiting from your lavish spending. So, there are a couple of things. I mean, these things have also occurred to me when I've spent, or I've seen some families spend lavishly on weddings and or whatever it might be, that okay, there is at least some collateral, what should I say, benefit from it, but it's not a question of justifications, and it's not a question of seeing things from the outside. I think the question of when you have a topic like the use the money force or the power of money to lead a conscious life, it's about yourself. It's about understanding first when you spent whatever you spent, not about seeing others. When you spent the money, did you feel that you spent it consciously, or was it an unconscious spending? And that only you can tell. I don't think anybody else outside you can know that fully, or even can judge that fully. So the first thing is about going back to who your own consciousness. And when you see, we all can feel, when something is done unconsciously or for total self-aggrandizement, and when it is done for a larger good. Now, the fact that even if one is doing things for oneself, there is still a benefit, is the way the nature works. This is the evolutionary work of nature, that whatever one does, even from the most unconscious acts, something and someone is benefited. But that does not mean that you can then justify that unconscious action and say, see, because it's benefiting that fellow's, the caterer who's bringing so many tables, and Shamiana wala, and the chai wala, and the jalebi wala, so I should continue doing this. So I don't think it can be a justification, but however it does, everything has its own way of benefiting something. So, yeah. And I think this is also to do somewhere at the end on the fear, money and fear. Money is deeply rooted. This sense of, there's a deep relationship between fear and money that we all have, whether we are conscious of it or not. See, all these things that we are all saying. And it's something that even on a personal level, I felt it in myself. I mean, constantly, that okay, when I turn 100, or 120, which is possible, because I can't think of my life being less than that. But, when I turn 120, I possibly won't have enough. Maybe I won't be working, maybe the farm won't be going, so what will I do, how will I sustain myself? So these are fears. First of all, call it out. Don't try and hide behind, what should I say, don't hide behind all these things. So when you call out things as they are, then you can address them in the way you want to address them, in the way that is correct for you to address it. Security. Money is a deep relationship with security, deep relationship with fear, and also deepest relationship with faith and trust. Now, those who have this sense of abundance that you spoke about are those that generally live in a higher state of faith and trust than of fear. Those who have the sense of scarcity live in a higher state of fear and distrust than they do of faith. But these are questions for each of us to ponder on.
As I listen, as I'm listening to different questions, I think what I'm hearing from distilling a lot of the comments is that there is still this ambivalence about money being good or not. And I began my statement by saying money is good. It's how we earn it and how we spend it. So there is enough research which shows that till a certain amount, money does increase happiness. So it's the moral high ground to say money cannot buy you happiness. And to your point, after a certain level of wealth, it stops buying you that marginal, incremental unit of happiness. But if you don't have a comfortable home, if you don't have surety of being able to pay your medical bill, if you don't know where the meal comes from, you are not going to be happy. It is at a very higher evolved stage of surrender and faith, and there are very few people. And I have a problem if somebody suggests that you live in this world by completely surrendering when you are not ready, when the world is also not ready. So it's okay for people who have money to say money doesn't matter, but money matters a lot. And I'm delighted that a young person like yourself has the courage to, stand up in the room and say money is important and it's good to spend. So completely delighted with that. Thank you.
Just to add a little bit on whether ends justify the means. You asked that question. See, the point is that if you use the wrong means, the ends become tainted. I mean, that's the way to look at it, So, lots of people have this dilemma, and lots of people use shortcuts to achieve their ends. But how long will that last? If you are not building on a strong foundation, nothing that you build will last. Which is why, when he talks about how these things are set up, these are the ways, when you have quality, that's a strong foundation. And about the kibbutz, see, I'm not aware of the full kibbutz model. So, if you know how... Okay.
So now, I'm going to just request everybody, any questions, any thoughts, just hold them, take them with you to the lunch.